Hi everyone. So our next speaker is Bob Hanisch. He's with the National Institute of Standards and Technology and also the Research Data Alliance. And he's going to be talking to us a little bit about that aspect of things. So thank you very much for joining us, Bob.
Thank you for having me. And I took presenter's liberty to rework my topic a little bit based on a conversation I had with Jay Hattrick-Simpers last week. So I won't talk that much about the Research Data Alliance, which is just to say is an international organization now with some 8,000 individual members from 140 or 150 countries that discusses ways to improve data sharing. And of course, reproducibility is a common theme that goes through all the discussions in the Research Data Alliance. But given that I work at NIST, which is the US National Metrology Institute, I thought I would focus more closely on a metrology perspective on reproducibility. And if the word metrology seems foreign to you, it's the science of measurement. And at NIST, we try to measure things very, very carefully. And we work very closely with other metrology institutes around the world in finding ways to improve measurement technology. I also want to credit my co-author, Ann Plant, who's a NIST fellow. Much of the material that I'm going to present here is described in the article behind this DOI, which originated with a report that we were asked to write for the National Academy's study on reproducibility. And that was morphed into an article in the Data Science Journal of Harvard. So you see these headlines all the time about the reproducibility crisis. Is there a crisis? Well, we think not. Are there reasons for concern? Absolutely. And the previous talk makes me think I should probably update my slides a bit to raise the level of concern. But it's clear, processes need improvement. There are wasted resources, some, but there are multiple factors that lead to these challenges around reproducibility. Some are social, such as the publish or perish syndrome, getting credit for data sharing, applying best practices in data curation and following the FAIR principles. Well, one of the biggest problems is unknown unknowns. And I'm talking mostly about experimental data here, but I think it could also apply to simulation data, to computer modeling, in that there's simply parameters that can be affecting the outcome of an experiment that you aren't even aware of. And let me just share a brief anecdote. My colleague Berend Mons from the Netherlands, and who leads the Go Fair initiative, works in the biomedical research domain. He was interacting with a laboratory in South America, and they were having trouble repeating their own experiments. Each time they ran an experiment, they got an inconsistent result with the previous ones. And they were describing all of their protocols and so forth, and Berend couldn't see anything wrong. So he actually visited the laboratory. And it turned out, when the technicians were preparing samples for this experiment, they were smoking. And smoking, obviously, was contaminating the samples, but it was not a parameter that he even imagined would affect the outcome. So we have to deal with the unknown unknowns. Coming from the metrology community, of course, we have our own terminology. And I must say it is a little bit different than the terminology that was introduced earlier today. In our case, we talk about reproducibility in terms of measurements that may be done under different conditions in different locations with different operators, different measuring systems, but that actually get to the same measurand, the same quantity. Repeatability is another concept where under conditions that include the same measurement procedures, the same operators, same measuring system, and so forth, you can get replicate measurements that are consistent within the uncertainties. Precision and accuracy, I think you're all familiar with these concepts and their differences. But there's this international vocabulary of metrology, the shorthand name of which is the BIM, and it uses these terms. And so in the metrology community, this is what we tend to speak of. There are other R words, replicability, robustness, and so forth, but reproducibility and repeatability are the ones that really prevail in the metrology community. So when science is not reproducible, is it bad science? Well, maybe. It can highlight bad science. You know, there's a famous case of cold fusion, but in general, we see situations where, you know, there's poor interpretation of results, there's cherry picking, you know, choosing the data that you think is supporting your hypothesis and ignoring others, inadequate control of variables. But often, the lack of reproducibility is simply because we have inadequate measurement technology. And here I draw an example from my many years in astronomy, the measurement of the Hubble constant, which when it was first measured by Slipher back in the 1920s had a value over 600 kilometers per second per megaparsec. And over, you know, 80 years, 100 years, it has now been refined down to values that hover around 73. So, you know, an order of magnitude difference because the measurement technologies simply were not able to pursue galaxies at the distances that are required to really make this a highly precise measurement. One of the things that is actively pursued in the world of metrology are key comparisons. So the National Metrology Institutes around the world agree to make measurements aiming at the same quantity, but using deliberately different techniques and different types of instrumentation. The whole point of this is to make sure that you are actually getting at the right physical entity. So there are systematic measurements of material properties. These institutes register their calibration and measurement capabilities in this key comparison database with the major focus on reproducibility, testing different measurement approaches, including uncertainty characterization. And what we find there is that when results are inconsistent, it's often due to the different techniques actually measuring different things, exposing new physics or new chemistry. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing because then you end up with much more robust understanding, one of your measurement technologies, but two of the fundamental physics or chemistry that you are trying to assess through your measurement technology. Uncertainty is really the watchword in the world of metrology as well. Characterization of uncertainty is fundamental. And there is a guide to the expression of uncertainty in measurement. The shorthand name for that is the GUM, which is part of the fundamental document collection managed by the International Bureau of Weights and Measures, the BIPM in Paris. And these are the attributes about uncertainty characterization that are fundamental in metrology. You need to have, uncertainty is created by an incomplete definition of the measurand. The measurand is the quantity that you're trying to measure, an imperfect realization of the definition, non-representative sampling, inadequate knowledge of environmental effects, smoking in the lab, for example, bias in reading out instrumentation, finite instrument resolution, and so on. So there are many sources of uncertainty. And what happens normally in the metrology community is that one develops an uncertainty budget and has to understand how uncertainties propagate through a measurement system. In the end, what you want is a measurand value and its uncertainty characterization so that comparisons with other measurements can be made robustly. So in terms of reporting uncertainty, we expect metrologists to state their plan, to look carefully for systematic sources of bias and uncertainty, to characterize the quality and robustness of the experimental data and the protocols that they have used, to minimize bias in data reduction and interpretation of results, and minimize confusion and uncertainty in reporting and dissemination. We're also concerned about establishing confidence. This means that when you're reporting results, you need to describe how ambiguities have been reduced and where they remain. You need to provide supporting evidence and be clear about any assumptions you've made. Fully describe the samples, your methods, your software, your reagents, and your analysis methods. And, you know, I sort of go back to the 3rd grade where your teacher said, show your work. We need transparency into the processes used in doing the experiment and doing the analysis and determining the final outcome. So show your work. NIST operates a suite of measurement services that support our efforts in improving reproducibility and confidence in measurement. We have a catalog of reference materials, which are typically used by private industry to calibrate instruments and processes. We have a catalog of reference data, which are data sets that are very thoroughly vetted by domain experts on our staff at NIST. And these, for example, will be databases that describe, say, the tensile properties of various alloys of steel, which are very important to people who build bridges and build skyscrapers so that they know that they will not fall down. We have a catalog of reference instruments and a catalog of calibration services so that people can actually send us instrumentation that we calibrate within our lab and then send their instruments back with, you know, basically a pedigree of the measurement capacity, how it's been calibrated against fundamental references that we maintain at NIST. Speaking a bit more about our standard reference data, because this is a catalog that my team maintains at NIST. These are data that are critically evaluated. They're assessed by experts and are proven to be trustworthy. They have numerical data that's all has uncertainty characterizations. We check that it's reasonable. For example, if somebody's measuring a velocity, it certainly can't be greater than the speed of light, things like that, consistent with physical principles, and assess the usability. Are the data sufficiently described with metadata and documentation so that they are easily used and digested? We also have what are called digital data objects. These are things like photographs, fingerprints, and so forth that have been represented in digital form. And these are objects that have to be tested and experimental data or calculated data have to be quantitatively compared. So the other thing that we are doing to help improve reproducibility is to build systems that assure that data are fair from birth. And you've all heard the FAIR acronym many times, so I won't have to go into that. One thing we're doing here is building laboratory information management systems that capture and organize data as soon as they are taken with some experimental apparatus. This allows us to preserve and recover data, track samples, automate conversion of data that might be originally in a proprietary format to an open format, and build up a database that allows us to not only know what we did, when we did it, but why did we do it? What was the aim of our experiment? And this enables going from an instrumental measurement all the way through to the publication stage with all of the associated metadata, persistent identifiers, analysis tools and methods that were used in doing that analysis. So it depends on the research domain. Right now, we have done most of our work around electron microscopy. but we are intending to expand scope here to other types of experimental apparatus and other types of research disciplines, such as biological systems and chemical systems. So the LIMS, the Laboratory Information Management System, is comprised of metadata, extractors, file management tools that goes into a repository. Data processing can happen within the LIMS, for example, calibration or baseline removals and so forth. And then the data can be moved out to a publicly accessible repository where it is accessible by the research community generally. For electron microscopy, we have a system called the Nexus Limbs, and this does all of those fundamental steps. This also allows for data to be transported through space and time. And by that, I mean, suppose you have a graduate student or a postdoc, they spend several years collecting data, they go away to their next position, and now you've got a pile of data and you have no idea what it means, you don't know why it was taken. With a LIMS system, all of that annotation becomes automated, with the exception of the experimenter starting up a session and saying, this is my sample, today I'm going to measure these properties. Everything else, the operating characteristics of the instrumentation and so forth, are automatically logged so that you know what was done and why it was done. The other thing we're doing at NIST to help shed light on reproducibility is called our research data framework. This is a community effort where we are building a map of the research data space, who, what, where, when, why, to help stakeholders in research data understand best practices around research data management and research data sharing. We want to help people understand costs and benefits and risks, and build basically a consensus document that's based on the conversations we have amongst stakeholders in research data. Ultimately, we hope this is a tool that can be used to change and improve the research data culture in an organization. It's a complex world out there in research data. There are lots of roles within organizations, various funding models and sustainability plans. Decisions need to be made about how long to keep data, how to assess data quality, and how to measure the value of research data. And of course, that value is directly correlated with these questions around reproducibility, replicability, reliability, and robustness. So we want to increase research integrity with quality data and improve transparency. And again, transparency is another aspect of reproducibility. Black box software, you don't know what it's doing on the inside, is not, I think, a solution to improving reproducibility. You need to know what's happening. At the same time, we want to reduce costs and maximize efficiency, guide risk management and reduction, helping people understand their risk positions and roadmaps for improvement, and increase scientific discovery and innovation through better adherence to the FAIR principles. There are many stakeholders in the research data ecosystem, from government agencies and national laboratories, universities and academia, and so forth. I won't read through all of these, but in each of these stakeholder communities, there are different areas of emphasis in terms of where they spend their time and effort in the research data lifecycle. So we have an initial publication describing the Research Data Framework core, and it is grouped into 6 major lifecycle stages, each of which has categories or topics and subcategories or subtopics, as well as a list of informative references. These lifecycle stages are things I'm sure you've all seen before, from envisioning through to planning, generating and acquiring, processing, analyzing, sharing and reusing, preserving and discarding. And in each one of these areas, we have articulated all of the aspects within that area, the categories and subcategories, that if you are a chief data officer, if you are a bench scientist, if you are someone doing computer simulations, these are the things that you need to be aware of. These are the people and organizations that can help you to navigate your way through the research data ecosystem. We're conducting 2 pilot studies, one which we call our university cohort, the other which is a horizontal cross-cutting through many research disciplines, and a vertical in the material science domain, since it's also a major research area at NIST. We're conducting workshops with community engagement, where we will test and refine our framework core, updating it where we identify gaps, remapping things where our initial categorization turned out to be not quite right. And then using that information for our team at NIST to create what are called framework profiles. And these profiles identify, as, again, if you are the university librarian, if you are in charge of the lab, you have a profile that identifies the aspects of research data management that are germane to your responsibilities. So in conclusion, we believe that applying the concepts associated with metrology to scientific research more broadly could really help to improve quality and confidence. The FAIR principles definitely help to expand data sharing and reuse. It's really critical in terms of improving reproducibility to identify and quantify sources of uncertainty. But the lack of reproducibility does not necessarily mean bad science. There are problems, but inconsistent results can occur because not all aspects affecting a measurement are known. And it's really through these inconsistencies that science advances. So let's not call this a crisis. Let's call it a challenge and rise to meet that challenge through improving the methods that we use to do experiments, to run simulations, and to document those so that others can understand their robustness, their reliability, and ultimately their reproducibility. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks, Bob. That was remarkable. I think Laura, would you like to ask you a question?
Hi, thank you for the great talk. Sorry, I cannot turn the camera on. No, I was wondering about situations which are very often seen in astronomy that are transient processes like a supernova event or things that turn on, stay, and then decay, but you cannot reproduce the observations by definition. That was the origin of my question.
Yeah, astronomy is a rather special field, and that we cannot control our experiments. We simply observe. And you're right, you can't say, well, run that supernova again with a different initial mass function for the star, and let's see what happens. So what we do, of course, is we collect lots of examples. And through comparing those examples, we build up models that we can not only explain what we've seen, but hopefully can predict what will happen in other cases. That's just the nature of the field, but it's not unique to astronomy. Think about geoscience. Earthquakes and tsunamis, volcanoes happen as they're going to happen. And you just have to collect the data. And if you collect enough data and build it into a sophisticated enough model, it becomes predictive. That's the challenge, for example, in climate modeling, right? You can't run a different climate every day and see where we're going to be in 50 years.
Right. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. It was great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments? The point about astronomy and measurement is actually really well made. And so if you go back to the history of least squares, there's a historian of statistics, Stigler, and he describes how least squares, the development of least squares was actually this triumph of an astronomer, Mayer. And and he actually did better than Euler. And the reason was because Mayer knew that his measurements were consistent and had been made under similar conditions, and so he could trust them. And so it's actually a very interesting the relationship with the astronomy and measurement.
There was a famous story, and I'm forgetting exactly which, maybe it was Herschel or something, who wanted some data. He didn't want another astronomer's interpretation of the data. He just wanted the data because he wanted to do his own calculations. And that's a really important aspect about reproducibility. Show your data. Don't show censored data that you've censored or massaged to make it more amenable to the thesis that you wanted to prove. Show the raw data. And this, one of the reasons I got into this myself is I started my career in radio astronomy, where the way we presented our data was in contour maps. And I would spend lots of time at a computer terminal redrawing contour levels to demonstrate the features that I thought were the significant ones in the data. I realized that that wasn't very honest. I should just share the data and let people draw their own contour levels or visualize the data as they see fit, and have them draw or determine whether the conclusions I've drawn are borne out by the data or not. When I initially proposed back in the early 90s that astronomers should, as a requirement, share their raw data or calibrated data, at least as part of the publication process, I was laughed out of the room. Why would we ever share our data, you know? But times are changing now, some 30 to 40 years later, that it's becoming the norm rather than the exception.
Are there any other questions or comments? Does NIST mostly, no plans to move into social sciences or measurements of social sciences? We also can't reproduce, you know, the economy only happens one day.
Yes, that's true. We have some economists, but they basically study things like what is the economic benefit of developing a new measurement technology or something like that. But I don't think we're going to venture into that area. Sorry. Well, thank you very much again for your attention today, and I hope the metrology perspective on reproducibility is one that will help advance the ball down the field here.
Yeah, there's an awful lot, and I put some links to some of your papers, including the Harvard Data Science Review paper, which is just fantastic. So,
thank you so much.
Really appreciate the talk, Bob. Thank you very much.